guys, it's Kira and welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to be sharing a rollover wrap up because, as you may have noticed, I haven't shared a reading wrap up for November 2020 or December yet, and we are now somehow in 2021. How the hell did that happen? Please tell me, because I clearly have no idea. But I do want to talk to you about all of the books that I read in November and December. So we have a huge, gigantic, bumper end of 2020 wrap up before we jump into all of the wonderful books that I'm going to read in 2021. So to round off 2020, I'm going to be talking about, I think, 12 books. I read 4 books in November, and then clearly I read 8 books somehow in December. Now I did vlog about all 12 of these books because I was doing a lot of vlogging at the end of last year, which I love and will definitely be continuing this year. But I did talk about all of the books in great depth and detail in those vlogs. So today I'm going to try and be snappier, just give you a bit more of a brief overview on the book and my thoughts, and of course my rating for each of the books. But if you do want more in-depth thoughts and discussion on everything about the books, then I'll link all of the vlogs that I talked about these books in, so you can go and check them out and get all of the detail there. So without further ado, we have lots to talk about and I love to talk, so let's jump straight into it. So the first book I read in November was Loveless by Alice Oseman, which I gave 4 stars. This book was released in 2020 and it was one that lots of people were talking about, so I was very excited to read it and I definitely enjoyed it. Within this book we follow our main character Georgia, who is a first-year university student. Georgia is someone who loves romance, but throughout the course of the book comes to realise that she is actually asexual. This is a story about self-acceptance, self-discovery, and also, more than anything, I think this is a story about friendship. I love the way that Alice Oseman explores friendship, and that is definitely my favourite part about this book, because it really dives into the fact that friendships are some of the most important relationships that we have. We live in a world where in books, in movies, and just in life in general, our romantic relationships are seen as the most important relationships we have. And of course, they can be really, really important. And of course, if you do have a romantic partner, they're likely to be someone that you are really closely connected with. But we have so many other relationships that are equally important. From our family, and in this book specifically, our friends, we have so many connections that are all so important, and they are all relationships in and of their own right, and definitely are not second-rate to romantic relationships. And this book kind of really explores how all relationships that we have and all of the people that we value and spend time with are equally important and are equally formative in the way that we live our lives. I just loved how friendship was explored within this book. It was wonderful. And although it was a book about asexuality, just the exploration of friendship was something that I think everyone can relate to. Even though I'm of course not someone who is asexual, I still found so much value within this, and it was also extremely educational in learning about an experience that I haven't personally had as well. So I would highly recommend it, and I think this is my favourite Alice Oseman book that I've read so far. The next book I ticked off in November was Vicious by V.E. Schwab. This has been on my TBR for ages, so I was really glad to finally read it in November, and I also gave this one 4 stars. Within this book we follow college roommates Victor and Eli, who are extremely close at the time of their college relationship, but this is a book with 2 timelines. So we both follow Victor and Eli as students when they're in college and when they're really close, and then we also follow them later on in life when their relationship has become much more complicated. At college, Victor and Eli were extremely clever, and they were working on an exploration into EOs, or extraordinaries. These are people who have some kind of special ability that's usually formed after having a near-death experience, and Victor and Eli decide to do experiments in trying to have near-death experiences themselves to see whether they can become EOs. And then of course lots of dramatic things follow from that, and we have a lot of things going on. I feel I can't say too much about what happens without giving away any spoilers, but it's quite a dramatic book. I think the dual timeline really does add a lot to it, because you see how what happened in college has influenced the future and how these 2 timelines are so connected. The only thing I didn't love about this book was the fact that it's part of a duology. There is a second book, Vengeful, that I still need to read, and by the time I reached the end of this book I just wasn't sure that it needed a sequel. I think it could have been wrapped up within the first book, but something happens towards the end that just sort of makes way for a sequel that I don't think was entirely necessary and was probably more of a marketing technique. But I of course still need to read that second book, so I'll give you more thoughts on that when I eventually get around to it. We then moved on to a book that I didn't enjoy very much at all. This was a reread, so I had a pretty clear idea that I wasn't going to like it, but I was reading it for the Dark Academics Book Club, which is a book club I host along with some other booktubers, and that book was The Turn of the Screw by Henry James. This is a classic ghost story which follows a governess going to look after two young children and then basically seeing lots of ghostly happenings around this house and ways that ghosts are interacting with these children and trying to protect them. But there's a discussion around whether these ghosts actually exist or whether she is basically a hysterical woman who is just kind of losing the plot and seeing things that aren't there. It has the capacity to be interesting, and there are certainly interesting and chilling ghostly elements, but for the most part it's actually a book that feels quite dull, and there are parts where things happen that I assume would probably have been more scary at the time that the book was written, but in a world where we have access to so many like graphic and gory horror books and thrillers and TV shows that are super dark, this book kind of lacks that shock factor that I assume that Henry James was going for at the time of it being written, because of course this would have been like a scary ghost story at the time, but now as a modern reader I just think it lacks some of that impact and it just seems more of a dull story. It's quite short but it feels long. It's one of those types of books in my opinion. The live show for this one was on my channel, so I will link to that if you want to go and hear me as well as the other Dark Academics hosts talk about this one. I think I definitely liked it the least, but it was a really interesting discussion that we had about this book, so definitely go and check that out if you'd like to hear more thoughts. But we did finish November on a high by reading Christmas at the Island Hotel by Jenny Colgan. I love Jenny Colgan. She was a 2019 discovery for me because I read her other Christmassy themed book called An Island Christmas, and I loved that book so much. It was so festive and so wonderful that when I knew that this book had been released, I wanted to read it immediately, and it seemed like the perfect book to read at the end of November, getting ready for the festivities of December. And I ended up giving this one 5 stars, so it certainly lived up to my expectations. Jenny Colgan has written a series of books set on this one island called Muir, which is an island off the coast of Scotland, so it's like a very remote Scottish Highlandy type place, and it's this really tight-knit community. And so the characters that we follow in this book are the same characters that we follow in the first Island Christmas book. So it's really nice to revisit those characters and just have this incredibly feel-good vibe from a book that just feels so cozy and basically like a Hallmark movie in book format is the way that I would describe this book. There are some new characters thrown into this one, and this book basically surrounds the launch of a hotel on the island and all of these sort of like dramas and shenanigans that go around that. It's generally quite lighthearted and fun, but it does discuss some more serious themes as well. Particularly in this one, we discuss the theme of like postpartum depression, or just sort of having that experience of not connecting to parenthood and motherhood in the same way that you imagined that you would, as well as grief. So this book definitely deals with those more serious topics, but it kind of punctuates that with so much lightheartedness, and it always ends with a very wholesome and happy feeling. So you always feel good when you read these books, and I just absolutely loved it. So definitely recommend, although this is probably one that I'm now recommending for next Christmas because we are out of the festive season now. But even still, although it's set at Christmas time, it is just generally a feel-good book. So if you do fancy something that you know is going to be a happy read, then I would recommend anything by Jenny Colgan. Now, although I finished 12 books throughout November and December, there is a 13th book that I'll be discussing. So at the beginning of December, I started reading a book called The Love Square by Laura Jane Williams, and I didn't quite finish it, which is why I'm not giving my full thoughts or a rating on this book. But I just didn't really connect with this book. I read a large majority of it, and then I just got distracted and decided to move on to something more exciting. So I probably will finish that book at some point, but that's a book about a main character, I think Penny is the character's name, and she basically suddenly finds like 3 men almost consecutively who she's interested in and who are interested in her after having like a romantic dry spell. Or at least that was what I expected from this book from the blurb, but actually she kind of doesn't meet all of these men at once. She meets them like one after the other, and it just felt a bit convoluted and I didn't feel connected to the characters. So like I said, I may end up finishing it at some point, but I didn't quite finish it in December. I did share my thoughts on what I'd read up until the point of finishing it in a vlog, but then I just moved on and picked up something else. So moving on to the first book that I finished in December, I actually did a reading vlog, a 24-hour readathon in collaboration with Penguin Platform. So the vlog for the 3 books that I'm about to discuss is actually up on the Penguin Platform channel. I will link that for you so you can go and check it out over there. But I had such a fun time. It was the Cozy Christmas 24-hour readathon, and that title tells you everything that you need to know. But like I said, I finished 3 books during that readathon. So the first book that I read was Date Me Bryson Keller by Kevin Van Wy, which I gave 4 stars. This is a YA romance set at a school where there is a really popular guy called Bryson Keller. Bryson has been dared to basically accept the first person who asks him out every single week, and they date him for that week only. Up until this point, only girls had ever asked Bryson out, but one week our main character Kai decides to ask out Bryson and he accepts, and that causes a really interesting turn of events, and also is just such an interesting exploration of coming out on your own terms, which is really, really interesting. Such a heartwarming and lovely read, but one that definitely discusses some more serious topics as well. I then read a festive short story collection, Let It Snow by John Green, Lauren Miracle and Maureen Johnson. I've discussed this book on my channel before in a festive readathon that I did in 2019, and of course in the Penguin Platform vlog as well that you can go and check out. But essentially this is just a very light-hearted collection of stories all set on one night. We basically have like a Love Actually type of situation where there are 3 separate stories, but they're all definitely connected to each other and you see them gradually coming together, particularly in the conclusion. But the first story basically follows a main character called Jubilee who is stuck on a train on Christmas Eve, which has to stop because of this snowstorm, and she gets off and then meets some people, and that kind of kicks off her story. We then have a group of friends who are having a Christmas Eve movie night, and then they decide to go off to this diner because they're told that a load of cheerleaders that were on the same train as Jubilee have gotten off, and they basically want to go and meet and go out with these cheerleaders. And then finally we have a girl who has been recently through a breakup that she's still not over, and she's still hopeful that maybe her and her boyfriend might get back together on Christmas Eve. It's very light-hearted, lots of fun stuff. Didn't particularly like the John Green one, but the other 2 are okay. Nothing like groundbreaking, but fun if you want something festive. And then finally I read One Day in December by Josie Silver, which I loved and gave 5 stars. Though this book has December in the title and certain parts of the book are surrounding December and Christmas, it's definitely not a Christmassy book. A large majority of the book doesn't happen at Christmas time, and it's certainly not one that I would put off reading until Christmas. Within this book we have our main character Laurie. At the very beginning of the book she is on a bus and she meets this guy, or rather locks eyes with this guy who's waiting at the bus stop, and essentially she falls in love with him there on the spot, and she thinks that he feels the same way. But then the bus drives away and they are kind of separated. For a whole year her and her best friend are referring to this guy as like the bus stop guy, and they're always joking about what she'd do if she finds him. And then one day, a year later, her best friend introduces her to her new boyfriend at a Christmas party, and lo and behold, it is the bus stop guy. It's kind of like a love at the wrong place, wrong time kind of situation, where now her best friend in the whole world is going out with the guy that she kind of fell in love with on first sight, and it's about everything that follows from that, the complications and all kinds of things, sort of bringing these 2 people back into each other's lives, but in a way that they didn't expect. A wonderful book, a really great one that follows characters over a really long period of time, following the ways that their relationships evolve and grow, and I just found it to be really wonderful. It was a light-hearted romance, but it felt like it had a bit more depth to it, and there felt like higher stakes because of all of the ways that these relationships were connected with each other, and I just absolutely loved it. I've loved both of Josie Silver's books because she also wrote The 2 Lives of Lydia Bird that I read last year as well, and that was wonderful too. Next up, on recommendation from M, I picked up Writers and Lovers by Lily King. This was a wonderful book. I would describe this as like a contemporary literary fiction, and in this book we have our main character, Casey, who's at a pretty rubbish point in her life. She is a writer who is struggling to write her first novel and isn't really making much progress with that. She's working a job that she doesn't like as a waitress and doesn't really see a way out of it, and she's also dealing with grief in a couple of ways. Firstly, and most significantly, her mum passed away, and she's struggling with that sensation of loss of someone who is like pretty much the most important person in her life. And then she's also grieving for a short but quite intense relationship that ended, but she still has feelings for this guy. Casey then ends up meeting two men, both of whom are very different. One is a much older man, also a writer, who has children and is a widow, and therefore she feels that she can kind of connect to him on the level of grief and loss. And then another character who is a much younger guy, also a writer, also dealing with grief, but offers a very different future for Casey. And we see her kind of going through a period of growth and self-assessment as she tries to figure out what it is that she wants from her future, and therefore which of these two guys is the best fit for her, as well as going through the process of trying to write her manuscript and get it published and all kinds of other things. This one really delves into the really analytical process of writing, so it's interesting for anyone who is a writer. I'm obviously not, but it was still really interesting to read as a reader, and it was just a really intriguing look into loss, into grief, how people who are dealing with grief want to connect with people who have that shared experience, who can understand their pain, and of course of romance, but not in like the classic fluffy romantic sense. This was a much more gritty look at love and romance, and I really enjoyed it. Oh, and this was actually a 5-star read, by the way. But from the gritty romance to the completely fluffy and light-hearted romance, we have A Christmas Kiss by Vicky Pattison. Anyone from the UK? Yes, that is Vicky Pattison from Geordie Shore, by the way. I actually got this book in a book box from A Box of Stories, which is a book box that basically provides you 4 books that would otherwise have basically been destroyed, that weren't going to be sold. And so it's a really interesting way to support books in like an environmentally friendly way, and also get some surprising new finds. And this one basically focuses on a young fashion designer, or rather aspiring fashion designer, who at the beginning of the book is working for a really horrible boss, but then she basically decided to go out, try and find a better job, and figure out what she wants from her life, and basically climb up the career ladder. But as she's climbing up this career ladder, we gradually see her kind of like losing her connection with who she is at her core, and we basically see this main character, Amber, going on a journey of trying to balance her career ambitions with who she really is, as well as some romance thrown in there as well. Not a groundbreaking book, but a really nice, fun, light-hearted romance that I enjoyed. Next up, we had a 5-star read that made its way onto my top 10 books of 2020, and that was Such a Fun Age by Kylie Reid. This was a book that I'm sure I'm not the first person you've heard talk about, because it's a book that has been given so much attention this year, and rightly so, because it is so incredible and also talks about such an important topic, and that is the topic of performative activism as well as privilege. Within this book, we have a main character called Amira, who is a babysitter for a rich white family. Amira is a young black woman, and one day when she's looking after the child for this family that she is a babysitter for, she's basically stopped and accused of having kidnapped this child, which then causes a mass of events to sort of unfold surrounding this one particular circumstance, in which various people, all of whom are white, have a lot of ideas about what Amira should do in response to the situation, and it really dives into how these people act in a way that is completely performative, with their own best interests at heart rather than Amira's, and in a way that clearly shows their lack of understanding of how privilege differs based on race. It's a really interesting book. It explores those themes in such an incredible way, and Amira is such a wonderful main character. She is someone who is really confident, but also is sort of dealing with a lot of internal struggle, figuring out what she wants to do with her life, as well as dealing with all of these problems that have suddenly sort of thrown themselves into her life. And it's just a really great book, so definitely recommend it if you haven't read it already. The next book I read was unfortunately a disappointing read for me, and that was These Violent Delights by Chloe Gong. This is a Romeo and Juliet retelling, which I ended up giving 2 stars. I really didn't enjoy this one, and the reason I didn't enjoy it, well, there was a few reasons, but primarily it was because I went into this expecting a Romeo and Juliet retelling, in the sense that I was expecting some kind of Shakespearean atmosphere or more of a connection to the Romeo and Juliet story, whereas actually what we have is a 1926 Shanghai where there are basically 2 warring gangs, and that is kind of the main connection to Romeo and Juliet. But actually a large proportion of this book isn't really about this star-crossed lovers theme, although that is definitely present. It's more about this weird phenomena that's taking over the city, where people are basically like hurting themselves really violently, and there seems to be some kind of virus spreading through the town. And so Roma and Juliet basically take it upon themselves to figure out what is going on and put a stop to it. So it's actually more of like a dystopian sci-fi type thing than Romeo and Juliet, in my opinion. The like urban city fantasy style setting gave me more Six of Crows vibes than Romeo and Juliet vibes, and I didn't like Six of Crows, but I know lots of people do. So if you do like Six of Crows and you like that kind of like gang urban fantasy setting, then probably give this book a try. You'll probably like it, but for me it just wasn't the one. And the final book that I picked up in December was A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. I gave this one 4 stars, though it was a reread, and I knew that I loved this book. It's just a wonderful festive read, and it's obviously a Christmas classic. We obviously follow our main character, Ebenezer Scrooge, who is visited by 3 ghosts, the ghost of Christmas past, present and future, on Christmas Eve, and they're basically there to show him the error of his ways and make him a better person. It's a very like moral Victorian story, but it also is just like really lovely to read about. It's nice to see Ebenezer Scrooge become a much nicer person. It's kind of like The Grinch, but like Dickensian, and I really like it. It's a fun story, it's short to read, and I just absolutely love returning to this one at Christmas time. Well, I'm not gonna lie, I'm quite impressed with my speed at discussing all of these books. Like I said, if you do want any more in-depth thoughts on any of these books, then all of the vlogs mentioning each of these books will be linked and sort of marked out so you know which book is in each vlog in the description box down below. So definitely go and check them out if you want to hear more in-depth thoughts on any of these reads. But I hope you've enjoyed this speedy rollover roundup, which has brought us to the end of every single book that I have read in 2020. I really hope you enjoyed hearing all of my thoughts, and I would love to know if you've read any of these books, what you thought of them. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.